The prayer was never meant to be heard. It was a thought shaped like desperation, whispered into the dark of a collapsing manufactorum chapel where the incense had long since burned down to bitter ash and the imperial aquila hung, crooked above a cracked altar. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth as I spoke it, the sound of distant artillery rolling through the stone like a slow, patient heartbeat. I did not ask for salvation. I asked only that the pain stop, that the noise fade, that something, anything answer me before the walls came down. The warp listens best when hope is exhausted. If you are drawn to these moments, to the places where faith and terror bleed into one another, remember to lend your mark to this chronicle. Let the Vox carry it onward. Like, share, and subscribe, not as a ritual of numbers, but as a way to ensure these stories are not lost to static and dust. I was a menial clerk once, before the sirens, before the sky split. My days were measured in data slates and stamped parchments, in the dull glow of lumen strips and the smell of machine oil soaked into everything. Terra was far away, a name spoken with reverence but never expectation. The Emperor watched from 1,000 icons, his gaze serene and distant, sustained upon the golden throne, so that the Astronomicon might burn and guide ships through the madness of the immaterium. That was the catechism, repeated until it felt as solid as the stone beneath my boots. Yet when the first warp breach tore open the district, catechism turned brittle. The breach announced itself not with light but with silence. Vox traffic died mid-syllable. Servitors froze, augmetics whining as if confused by an order that never came. Then the air grew thick, heavy enough to press against the lungs, and the smell changed. It was sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, layered over the familiar tang of promethium fumes. People screamed when the colors followed. Hues that did not belong to the spectrum, bleeding out of nothing and staining reality itself. I remember thinking absurdly that the administratum had no form for this. Astra Militarum troopers tried to hold the line. They always do. Glass fire crackled and burned holes through shadows that laughed as they reformed. An officer's voice barked. Orders through a Vox grill already, warping with interference. Each command growing more frantic as the men around him vanished, into claws and mouths that unfolded like bad dreams. Faith was shouted louder, laser guns fired faster, but the warp does not care for volume. It cares for cracks. It finds them and widens them with exquisite patience. I ran when the first of them looked at me and smiled. That smile was too wide, too knowing, as if it recognized something unfinished inside my soul. I fled through corridors I had walked 1,000 times, now stretched and bent into unfamiliar angles. Doors led to stairwells that spiraled downward far longer than the building allowed. Data slate screens flickered with sigils that made my eyes ache. Somewhere above, the manufactorum's reactors screamed as safety limits failed, and the sound followed me like a promise. The chapel was supposed to be sealed. A forgotten remnant from an earlier compliance. Its locks rusted and its doors swollen shut. I threw myself against them anyway, shoulder screaming in protest, until the metal gave with a shriek that echoed like laughter. Inside, the air was colder. Candles guttered though there was no wind. And the Emperor's image loomed from the far wall, his features worn smooth by centuries of touch. I collapsed at the altar not out of reverence, but because my legs would not hold me any longer. That was when I prayed. Not the words drilled into me since childhood, but something raw and unformed. I begged for silence. I begged for an end. I promised nothing, because there was nothing left to promise. The warp heard me because I was empty. The first sign was heat, not the searing burn of promethium or plasma, but a deep settling warmth. Like embers banked beneath ash, the laughter outside the chapel faltered, replaced by a low hum that vibrated through the stone. The candles flared, their flames stretching impossibly tall, casting shadows that did not match the shapes that made them. I dared to look up at the Aquila, and for a moment I thought its eyes were glowing. They say demons arrive with spectacle, with thunder and screaming skies. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they arrive like an answer to a question you should never have asked. The air before the altar thickened, folding in on itself. And something stepped through that did, not tear reality, so much as persuade it to make room. It was tall, its outline flickering as if uncertain which version of itself to wear. Wings unfurled slowly, each feather edged with light that hurt to see. Its face was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Symmetrical and serene, eyes reflecting my own fear back at me until I could not tell where mine ended and its began. Faith, it said, and the word resonated through my bones rather than my ears. At last, I tried to speak the Emperor's name. The sound died in my throat. Every lesson, every warning about the ruinous powers crashed through my mind at once, but they felt distant, Theoretical. This was here. This was now. The thing before me knelt, mirroring my posture. Its presence filling the chapel with a pressure that was almost tender. It told me it had heard countless prayers like mine, whispered in trenches and void ships and dying cities. It told me that the warp was not cruel, merely honest, reflecting what mortals poured into it. Desperation in. Answer out. Its voice carried the cadence of a preacher, each phrase perfectly shaped to slide past doubt and lodge somewhere deeper. I realized with a cold clarity that it knew me better than any confessor ever had. Outside, the battle sounds changed. The shrieks of the demonic horde were joined by a new note, sharp and disciplined. Bolter fire thundered, each report a punctuation mark of finality. Through the chapel doors I glimpsed gold, a flash of auramite armor moving with impossible grace. Adeptus custodes, the Emperor's own custodian guard, had arrived. Their presence was overwhelming, a weight of authority that made the air feel cleaner, just by existing within it. The thing before me did not flinch. It smiled wider. "You see?" it murmured. "Even now he does not come to you. He sends others to die in his stead." A custodian's silhouette filled the doorway, guardian spear raised, its blade humming with contained power. His helm turned, lenses locking onto the altar, onto me, onto the impossible figure kneeling inches away. For a heartbeat, everything froze. I felt suspended between absolution and damnation, my prayer echoing back at me from every surface. The custodian spoke a single word, a command layered with authority and wrath. The demon rose in response, wings brushing the chapel ceiling, light spilling like blood across the stone. And in that moment, as reality strained and the warp pressed closer, I understood the price of being heard. The walls began to crack, not outward but inward, as if the chapel itself were folding around us. The Emperor's image fractured, stone face splitting along lines that glowed with the same impossible colors I had fled from earlier. Somewhere deep within the hive, alarms shifted pitch, reacting to forces their creators had never anticipated. The custodian advanced, each step deliberate, and the demon's laughter filled the space between heartbeats. My prayer had not ended the noise. It had only invited a louder answer. The terrible price was about to be paid, and I was standing at the center of the transaction. The custodian moved first, not with haste, but with the certainty of something that had never doubted its own purpose. His guardian spear swept up, the blade tracing a line of white-blue light that cut through the incense haze and made the air scream in protest. The demon answered with motion that was almost gentle, wings folding and unfolding as if adjusting a cloak, its feet never quite touching the stone. When spear and impossible flesh met, the impact rang like a struck bell, a sound so pure and violent it rattled my teeth and sent cracks spidering across the chapel floor. I was thrown backward by the shockwave, my spine colliding with the altar steps. Pain bloomed, sharp and grounding, and for a moment I welcomed it because it meant I was still real. Above me, faith and heresy collided in blinding arcs of light and shadow. The custodian fought with brutal economy, every movement a lesson in lethality refined over millennia. The demon flowed around him, its form blurring, laughter cutting through the thunder of bolter fire now echoing from the corridors beyond. Each clash bent the space between them, as if reality itself were unsure which side it favored. I tried to crawl away. My hand slipped on stone that had grown warm, almost soft beneath my palms. The air tasted like ozone and burnt metal, layered with that cloying sweetness that now made my stomach churn. As I dragged myself toward the shattered pews, my eyes caught on the Emperor's fractured visage. One half of the stone face remained serene, the other twisted into a shape that might have been anguish, or might simply have been damage. I could not tell any more. I wondered dimly if he could see this, or if terror was too far, his attention bound elsewhere by the endless demands of survival. The demon spoke again, its voice threading through the clash as easily as smoke. It addressed the custodian by no name I recognized, titles and honors that sounded like flattery and insult intertwined. It spoke of duty calcified into dogma, of sacrifice demanded so often it had become meaningless. Each word seemed aimed not at the custodian's ears, but at the cracks in the world around us, at the doubts no catechism could fully erase. The custodian did not respond. His silence was a weapon as sharp as his blade. The chapel ceiling gave way with a roar, chunks of stone falling upward instead of down, vanishing into a roiling vortex of color and motion. Through the widening tear I glimpsed shapes moving like schools of predatory fish, their forms half-formed and hungry. The warp was pressing closer, drawn by the violence. By the prayer that had opened a door it was all too eager to widen. I felt it brushing against my thoughts, cold fingers testing for weakness. Memories surfaced unbidden. Regrets and small shames magnified until they threatened to drown me. A bolter round punched through the demon's wing, detonating in a spray of light that scorched the far wall. The creature hissed, the sound sharp with genuine irritation, and I realized with a jolt that it could be hurt. The custodian pressed the advantage, driving forward, spear haft cracking against impossible bone. Each strike forced the demon back toward the altar, toward me. I scrambled, heart hammering, my breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded too loud in my own ears. Another figure appeared in the doorway. Then another, gold armor catching the warped light. More adeptus custodes. Their arrival shifting the balance of the room like a sudden change in gravity. They moved as one, a wall of auramite and will. Bolters roaring in disciplined bursts that tore chunks from the demon's form. The creature reeled, its perfect symmetry unraveling. Beauty peeling away to reveal something raw and furious beneath. "You called," it snarled now, its voice losing that soothing cadence. "You begged." Its gaze snapped to me, eyes burning with accusation. In that instant, the weight of what I had done crashed down fully. I had not merely asked for an end. I had invited this. The warp had answered honestly, as it always does, and the answer was tearing my world apart. Shame burned hotter than fear, and I clutched at the aquila, pendant beneath my shirt as if it might anchor me to something solid. The lead custodian advanced, bolter slung now, spear raised high. He spoke finally, his voice resonant with authority that felt older than the walls around us. He did not address the demon, but me. He named my sin without malice, without anger, as if reciting a fact. He told me to look away. I could not. The demon's eyes held me fast, a mirror reflecting my desperation back at me until I wanted to tear it out of myself. The spear came down in a thrust that seemed to pierce not flesh but concept. The demon screamed, a sound that shredded the air and sent waves of nausea through me. Light and shadow imploded, collapsing inward as the creature's form unraveled, its wings disintegrating into motes that burned out before they hit the floor. The warp breach shuddered, contracting with a wet, sucking sound that made my skin crawl. For a heartbeat, I thought it might close. Then the altar split. A fissure tore through the stone, straight down the center, glowing with the same impossible hues. The chapel groaned, its foundations failing as the reality anchor finally gave way. The custodians fell back in perfect coordination, forming a protective ring around the breach. Their vox grills crackled with rapid exchanges, words clipped and urgent, references to containment protocols and reinforcement delays. I caught fragments enough to understand that this was not over. The demon's death had been a spark, not an end. The warp surged, not with laughter now, but with a low, mournful resonance that vibrated through my marrow, shapes pressed against the thinning veil, drawn by the echo of the prayer that still hung in the air like a wound that refused to close. One of the custodians reached down, hauling me to my feet with a grip that could have crushed bone but did not. Through his helm, his lenses bored into me, and for a moment I felt utterly seen. "You will live," he said, not as comfort but as sentence. "You will remember." They moved me then, half-carried, half-dragged through corridors that were shedding pieces of themselves. Walls peeled away to reveal nothing but roiling color beyond. Servitors lay scattered, their augmetics sparking uselessly. Skitari elements appeared from side passages, red robes torn and blackened, their mechanical limbs moving with relentless precision as they laid down, suppressive fire against things I could not quite focus on, without feeling my thoughts slide sideways. The smell of promethium was everywhere now, sharp and choking. We reached an extraction point just as the manufactorum's core finally failed. The ground lurched, gravity faltering, and for a terrifying second I felt myself lifting, the pull of the warp tugging at every atom. The custodians anchored themselves, boots magnetized, forming a living bulwark against the impossible. I clung to one of them, fingers digging into auramite seams, and screamed until my throat tore. When it was over, there was no triumphant silence. Only the crackle of fires, the distant rumble of collapsing structures, and the flat, stunned quiet of survivors who did not yet understand the shape of their survival. The breach had been sealed or suppressed, or driven deeper into the hive's bones where it would be someone else's problem. The Astronomicon still burned, far away and untouchable. Terra still stood. By the measures that mattered to the Imperium, this was a success. They took me away for questioning, for cleansing rites, for the long, quiet process of determining whether I was a liability or merely a cautionary example. In the days that followed, as I lay beneath lumen strips and recited prayers that tasted like ash, rumors spread through the hab levels. Some said a fragment of the Emperor's will had manifested to smite the foe. Others whispered that the warp itself had recoiled in fear of his servants. A few, speaking very softly, claimed that the prayer had been answered exactly as intended, and that the cost was simply higher than anyone wanted to admit. I do not know which of them is true. I only know what I felt when the demon looked at me, and what I feel now, when the nights are too quiet and the memories come back unbidden. The warp listens. It always has. It does not judge the worthiness of a prayer, only its intensity. When you are desperate enough, empty enough, it will answer you with perfect clarity. The terrible price is not always paid in blood or broken stone. Sometimes it is paid in certainty, in the slow erosion of faith as you realize that being heard is not the same as being saved. I live with that knowledge now, a clerk no longer, a survivor by no virtue of my own. And every time I pass an icon of the Emperor, every time I smell incense burning low, I feel the echo of that warmth beneath the ash, waiting for the next voice to break in the dark.